right. Hello, everyone. It is so good to see you here Friday at 9 p.m.
Who's ready to talk mental health? That's how you start a panel.
That
at 9 p.m.
Well, see, I'm actually slightly tamped down because the Friday night at 9 p.m. really sticks with me because I actually had tickets to the Yankees game tonight. So those are now off being enjoyed by some other people, so we can be here. So I won't whine about it that much because I'm actually really honored to be here.
We're just going to start the panel that way.
Yeah, I won't whine about it that much, but
just emphasizing it.
But I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really delighted to see all of you out in the audience. And how many of you have attended a mental health panel with us before? Yay. Excellent. Okay, so for a lot of you, for those of you who haven't been here, I just want to have a brief word of introduction. All of our panelists will introduce themselves in a second. I just want to make a brief note about how we're going to conduct this. I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions, and they're going to have a conversation among themselves. And we're going to open this up for questions. So please think about whatever questions you want to ask our panelists. It's an unparalleled opportunity to meet some wonderful people in the comics and mental health community who've been working in this area for a long time and have a lot of deep and interesting things to say. So we will be opening this up for questions soon. But first, I would like all of our panelists to introduce themselves and say explain why they're here. Sort of what the connection is between the issue of mental health and their work, and your work.
No pressure.
No pressure at all.
Hi, my name's Heather Antos. I am an editor in the comics industry, most known for my work at Marvel, on Star Wars, Deadpool, and co-creator of Gwenpool. I am now at Valiant, where I'm editing a plethora of things I can't talk about, which is fun. But no, why I'm here, mental health representation is very, very important to me, especially showing it in our mainstream media, how that influences our youth and even our more mature adults. It's important to see, it's important to be normalized. I myself live with high-functioning CPTSD and manic depression and general anxiety. It's a lot of fun, especially events like this. But I think it's super important to talk about because talking about it, as uncomfortable as it may be, helps it be normalized and other people seek help and not feel ashamed for something that is normal.
Yeah, very much so. And with your work, you work with several companies now at this point. Do you find it something that you're integrating into your work as well?
Always, yeah, always. I think, for a long time, a lot of companies have said, multiple, and just media in general have said, we want to reflect the world outside our window, but they haven't necessarily done a good job of that. They've reflected a very small pinpoint from a very small alley, from a very high up, tower, and it's time that we, break down some of those brick walls that are blocking the view from that window and actually see the beautiful views that are actually out there.
Wonderful. Well, you may have felt a little pressure, but you clearly nailed it quite well.
I'm old hat. I've done this panel before.
Hi, I'm Alex Segura. I am the co-president of Archie Comics. I'm also a novelist and comic book writer. My novel series, it's a PI series set in Miami, where I'm from, and the protagonist struggles with addiction, alcoholism, depression, anxiety, all things that are relatable and very common. I feel really strongly about showing that kind of arc of addiction and recovery. It's a long, meaningful process, and it's not just my big gripe. I see so much fiction where you have the hard drinking person or the drug addicted person and they just get better immediately, and then the problem is solved in perpetuity, and I feel really strongly about showing that process in every step. I write this comic called The Black Ghost. It's a superhero noir. The protagonist is also an alcoholic and dealing with that struggle, so it's something that's important to me. So thanks.
Great. I'm Jim Higgins. I'm a former DC Comics editor way back in the 90s, and since then I have been a freelance editor, a writer, and teacher, probably mostly. So I teach comics writing and drawing. I've taught at the School of Visual Arts, I've taught at CalArts and Otis College of Art and Design and UCLA Extension in Los Angeles. I teach my home base there is with the the Society of Illustrators of Los Angeles. I suffer from anxiety and depression. Medication works wonders for me. I consider myself very lucky because there are people who it doesn't work great for or doesn't work at all for. I'm very excited about the possibilities of new types of medication that are on the horizon with these, formerly bad drugs, hallucinogens that are showing real promise in clinical trials. And one of the other things is I was a social worker for 5 years. So here in New York City, I'm actually from New York, went to LA in 2008, but I was a social worker here on Staten Island dealing with families where there was abuse and neglect. And yes, Alex, we never had someone recover from alcoholism overnight.
Yeah, it doesn't happen.
Very interesting. So that's me.
It usually takes $5.
Yeah. And then you're done.
Yeah.
At least one story.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Matt Miner. I'm a dog rescuer. We run a dog rescue. I also write comics. I'm known for my work with the band GWAR. Also books from Black Mask. Where else? Dynamite, A Way of Blue World. We've been putting together anthologies, kind of dealing with the trauma of the past couple of years. I suffer from anxiety, depression, PTSD. I'm also a recovering alcoholic and drug addict, and unfortunately I can't be medicated because I tend to abuse that stuff, so I have to just suck it up and deal with it, which really sucks. But you're right, it's been 10 years of struggle for me, and it doesn't really get much easier, honestly. Right now, I'm a bundle of nerves. I don't know if you can tell, but I think it's important to do, to positively represent people with mental health, issues in our media, because so often people are demonized, and then you have Trump on TV saying, well, it's a mental health issue. It's not about guns. You just want to strangle him, don't you? And yeah, so I think a lot of it starts in the media. I think a lot of it starts with how we represent people in TV and film and comics, and doing that positively is of utmost important to me. So, thank you.
Hi, my name is Lisa Wu, and people know me a lot from working with Aftershock Comics and A Way of Blue World. I do their sales and marketing, so I do a lot of relationship building. And as a marketer, I'm always seen as this happy, excited, go-lucky person. And a lot of people don't know about my background, which is that I was a former teacher. I taught gifted and talented students. And I see a lot of students struggling with mental health issues and being able to work through that. Currently, I'm at the Kubrick School. I'm teaching the business of cartoon art. And outside of comics, I've always been a huge advocate for normalizing mental health issues and also seeking professional help. There's nothing wrong with it, and I've done it, and it's been very, very helpful to always have somebody objective that actually kind of examine some of the issues that you go through. And I think it's very important for people like the people on this panel to educate and communicate the need to address mental health issues in a way that isn't didactic or preachy. But yeah, here you go.
Thanks. Thank you. Hi, I'm Praveen Kambam. I'm a clinical and forensic psychiatrist, and with Dr. Pozios here, Vasilis Pozios, and we co-founded a mental health and media consultancy, and we've been speaking at Comic-Cons, I think, for about 10 years, something like that, about 10 years now. And piggybacking on what the last two panelists said, how I got into it was initially on the clinical world, we were kind of taking care of people, right, and working with them. And mental health stigma is a huge issue, huge barrier. And frankly, from the professional side, we were not doing enough to deal with this. And we thought that actually looking at where it comes from, and one area of where it comes from is culture. Obviously, media and art influences culture, and so that's how we kind of got involved.
Hello, everybody. My name is Vasilis Pozios, and like Praveen just mentioned, I'm also a co-founder of Broadcast Thought, mental health and media consultancy that was born out of our frustration about how mental health issues were represented in the media in general, but with a specific focus on pop culture. And my particular interest being comic books. I've been a comic book reader since I was, I don't know, 3, 4, however old, you're able to like look at pictures of Batman and register them. So I've always been a fan of comics, and creating comics has always been near the top of my mind. And so fortunately, I've had the opportunity to kind of dabble in that a little bit. And most recently, with Matt Miner's anthology From a Wave Blue World, All We Ever Wanted, Stories of a Better Future. So
Better World.
If you haven't read that, then A Better World, I'm sorry.
He's
There's a
particular
lot of words
about that.
there.
Strike 2.
But yes, All We Ever Wanted, that's all you need to know.
Yeah, that's good.
And also was able to write a short story called Aura with Marguerite Sauvage about a superhero who has bipolar disorder, who kind of, lives to learn with having a mental health challenge, but doesn't define her, and is able to kind of show her superpowers to the world at the end of the story. So yeah, and we've been doing these panels now for about 10 years, and I'm very happy to see that there is a sizable audience past 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock at night,
Yeah.
Y'all rock.
It's amazing. It's amazing to see you all here, and also, hold on. Also, sorry, I thought I turned off the thing. That was just a text from my parents. A score. No, it actually was a text from my parents.
Score the game.
No, don't say. I promise you it wasn't a score of the game. But I've been taking
3-3 in the fifth.
No, see, I've been taking notes of what everybody is saying.
Nice.
And I can see why you're here, because when I was listening to what everyone was talking about, you're seeing such a diverse range of perspectives. You're seeing people who are building universes, they're writing stories, they're teaching, they're reflecting about influence, they're trying to sort of translate the experience of dealing with mental health issues in novels and comics, and I know that I'm sure that a number of you are dealing with things across platforms. And so I wanted to ask a question, to go right into the heart of it, which is this. After last year's panel, a video game came out called Gris, G-R-I-S, which is the whole premise of the game was representing what it's like to recover from trauma, and it's won a number of awards for its positive representation of mental health. And now we're here tonight, and the thing that a lot of people are talking about is the movie Joker, which I don't know if people are going to be giving it the same number of awards in terms of representation of mental health. I really don't know. I haven't seen the movie. So I want to hear your perspectives on where do you think we are in the representation of mental health? Are we in sort of a golden age? Are we still dealing with some age-old issues? Where are we with this issue? How do you see things going?
I think we're in a moment of self-awareness, and where we are realizing, and I think we've been realizing over the past several decades, that there is a lot of growth to be done. And so there's been an effort to represent, to showcase, but I think there's still been a struggle between the lines of glorification and representation. And I've not seen Joker, so I can't comment on that film whatsoever. But one of the things I can comment on is, a few years ago, five years ago or so now, we had this beautiful season of television on Netflix called Jessica Jones Season 1, which I thought was one of the most beautiful representations of PTSD. And for me personally, that show was part of me realizing, oh, I have been living with this for years and did not realize it, because it was represented in such a raw and real and emotional way that it wasn't just fixed overnight with a Band-Aid. But then we still get things, where we see villains and, just off the top of my head, a lot of the villains in comics and the Batman villains in particular is pick which disorder, that's the villain. Pick which disorder, that's the villain. And that's the awareness that we're trying to, I think, break from. Is mental health should not be villainized, and it isn't just a villain.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head with the glorification versus representation. And it's important that we're having these discussions because I think transparency and conversations are the way to any kind of, not solution, but just awareness. Sometimes people don't know the difference between what glorification and representation means. They think, if I just show it in the extreme, then that way I'm talking about it. And it's you really have to thread the needle. Representation is showing honestly, and I think that can be so impactful, just showing what people are struggling with in a meaningful way, and sometimes that creates a dramatic arc, and that's successful. Glorification to me is just you're using this to serve the purposes of the story, you're being extreme to get a reaction, and that's what we as creators and people that generate stories have to be mindful of, and I think about it a lot too. There's so many tropes in fiction that are so dangerous. Especially with crime novels, there's the kind of innocent woman trope where the cops walk into a room and they find a dead body and they never discuss who this woman was or what her past was, and it's just like used as a story prop. And I think that's so dangerous, such a dangerous thing to do, and it really dehumanizes the victim. And I think now I'm kind of veering off into this whole kind of crime fiction thing, but I think if you're mindful of stuff and you show things in a truthful, transparent way, then those stories have impact because they're real and they're genuine, as opposed to just doing something to get a reaction. And that's a short-term thing, and it's not as meaningful. So.
I think things have gotten better. The fact that we're at a panel on this would never have happened like 15 years ago, or probably wouldn't have. And I think that we're seeing characters who are dealing with mental health issues. We're of all different types. There's still a ways to go. And I think the thing that I see that constantly sticks in my eye, like, whoa, again, is the way that treatment is discussed. So a couple of people have talked about, they got fixed overnight, or the fact that Matt talking about sometimes it's management. It's not, you don't make it go away, But I always notice how in the media they don't talk about medication like very much at all. And so people come in and they're depressed and they're anxious and they get help. And they usually make that to seem like they're going to therapy. And that's great, but that's not what usually helps certain people in certain situations. So, bipolar disorder, there's so many people have been helped by medication and all different types, depression, anxiety. So it's definitely a big part of treatment for many, many people, and the fact that it's so rarely discussed in a fictional setting is troublesome. And I think that it adds to people. Now you'll see people in the world, friends or family, and they'll say, I know I'm depressed. And you'll say, well, maybe you should go get help. And they'll say, yeah, I guess I should go to therapy. You see, medication, I will say to people, medication helps me. I tell everybody I'm on medication. I'm on medication right now. And it works for me. So I tell people, look, at least try it. I don't know, I don't want to be on that for the rest of my life. I'm like, if you were diabetic and the doctor told you you had to go on diabetic medication, you wouldn't say, I don't know, I think I'm just going to handle that diabetes on my own. You know, so,
I'm that person.
so that's what's that.
I'm that person.
You know, like I said,
I'd be wrong, but.
medication, it's a complicated issue, like all things regarding mental health. It's not a one-size-fits-all, it's not a, you know, whatever. But that's why we're here, that's why there's so many of us on the panel. All right. So that's,
Oh, you got yours. Keep it
Yeah.
on the mic.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with everything that's been said here. You know, things are better, but there's a long way to go. You look at like 13 Reasons Why, that was awful. It was terrible, and that was very recent. And sure, seasons 2 and 3 got better, but I mean, it's still there. You know, that was. I don't know why I watched that because it was so freaking triggering, but I did anyways because I knew it was coming and it came and yeah. But you know, I think we have a long way to go, and I think we as creators have to be mindful. People are more mindful now about representing LGBTQ people in media and people of color, and I think we need more people who have the mental health issues to write about them. You don't need people who aren't suffering from these conditions trying to tell that story so much, in my opinion. You know, it's like it's like a straight person trying to tell the struggles of a queer person, and it rings hollow and it feels exploitative, in my opinion. So, but yeah, I mean, in general, we have a long way to go on this. You know, it feels like one of the last things that's being talked about as far as positive representation goes.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like it really is the last kind of frontier that we haven't really tapped into, which is a shame because clearly there's a growing mental health issue, especially in this country. Before the panel, I looked up some statistics and things like that, and we all know it's a growing thing that's happening in our country, especially with little kids. Like, they don't know how to deal with it, and their parents don't know how to deal with it. So, like, just with adults, nearly 20% of adult population reportedly suffer from some kind of mental health issue, and that's only the ones that are being reported. And then about 4.6 suffer from severe mental illnesses. If you break that down to the amount of people, that's about 10 million people in the US that suffer from this, and nobody's addressing it. People joke about it, people, you know, sometimes sexualizes the craziness and things like that in our media, and it's like, what? And then one thing, as a former teacher, is looking at it from, I see it from the parent's perspective, and I see it from, you know, teachers, like, how do we deal with this in a way that isn't scary to the kids at the same time? Because my second year at this prestigious school, it was a magnet school in Charleston, South Carolina. One day, the kids came in crying. I didn't know what was going on. Apparently, a former student at the school, before I started teaching there, I was only teaching there the second year, like 3 years prior, one of their classmates left the school and went somewhere else. And they told me that they just found out that, this was a 6th grader, by the way, killed herself. A 6th grader killed herself because she was not being able to cope with some kind of mental issues, from what I understand from the students, where she didn't know how to socially behave. She was awkward, she was made fun of, and the teachers didn't know how to deal with it. The parents definitely didn't know how to deal with it, especially culturally. She came from an Indian background, and culturally they just don't know how to deal with something like that. And just some of the statistics with young adolescents, you have 11% with mood disorders, and 10% with behavioral disorders, and 8% with anxiety disorders, and all those numbers are growing. And even though it's addressed, and I wouldn't say normalized yet, but it's easier for people to talk about mental illnesses these days and share that, there's just so much more that we can do. And I feel like with comics, especially, it's non-threatening way to address it, especially with young adults and kids, because it's just paper. It's animals, and it's, you know, people that look like them, and they can comprehend it a little bit better and absorb it. When I was on this panel, people got so excited that I was on this panel and that it was even being addressed. I had people from college that I haven't seen on my Facebook feed in a long time. It's like, oh my God, and tag their wives who are teachers and librarians and things like that. And somebody from Humanoids handed me this book called State of Mind. I wasn't even aware of this, but it's about a kid with bipolar disorder. Like, why isn't this in libraries and tools for teachers to kind of help kids, you know? So it's nice to have a panel like this that's trying to
I just want to say it
educate.
might be in libraries.
It better be, hopefully. Here you go.
All right, yeah, I agree with what everybody's been saying in terms of mixed evolution, I guess, of mental health representation in media. So I think we've had an increase in quantity and awareness, but where we've got to work a little bit harder on is the quality.
Yeah.
And so in the past, I think we had either these kind of caricature type representations, or the extra special episode, or this is the kind of lazy stereotype trope of why there's a villain, right? And so now I think things have, in many properties, they have become more nuanced. The Netflix series is a good example, and it shows that it can be very entertaining, where it's woven.
Jessica Jones, not.
Yeah, no, that's not 13 Reasons Why.
I'm talking about the Marvel Netflix series.
That, just to clarify
just to
that,
clarify
yeah.
that, yes. Yeah. I mean, I have some different thoughts about 13 Reasons Why, but we don't need to go there now.
Yeah, that's a whole other whole
yeah,
wax.
Yeah. So, anyway, thanks for derailing me here.
Yeah, my pleasure. That's what I do.
I think it was, these things, you know, were woven into the story, and I think that's the way to actually change the stigma and raise awareness in a more organic way. And so I think you've had movies where they either do that, or the entire movie is focused on a mental health issue, right? And we've praised those things, you know, Silver Linings Playbook is something that comes to mind. But I think the reality is that I'm not saying that I praise, I'm just saying that was...
No, I know.
Yeah. So I think the reality is that if really the stats by CDC is that 50% of at some point in your lifetime will have a mental health issue, mental illness.
A diagnosable mental health
disorder.
condition.
Yes.
Oh,
In your lifetime is the estimates by the CDC for Americans. So it actually is, so let's say, okay, look around the room, the person on your left or right is probably going to have this at some point in your lifetime, and it's not represented well. So I actually think that it should be just part of the story arc and woven in. And I think the other frontier that I think that we're struggling with is the violence. You know, there's the link to violence. As forensic psychiatrists, that's near and dear to what we deal with. And unfortunately, it's always the explanation for the violence. And you see it come out in politics, in policy, and discrimination, so it's real world impacts. I think that's another frontier you need to cross.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention. I mean, Lisa mentioned some statistics, but one stat that we quote frequently is, you know, only about 4% of violent crime is attributable to serious mental illness. But, you know, how often is mental illness thought of in the general public as being related to violent crime, especially with, you know, these rare incidents of like mass violence, but also in our media, like how often in entertainment media, comic books and comic book related media is mental health connected to violence. And I think that within the subsection of mental health representation, the representation of, you know, violence and how that relates to or doesn't relate to mental illness really is the last frontier, I think, that hopefully will be addressed at some point. But again, as Jeff mentioned at the opening of this talk, of course, everybody's talking about Joker and what does Joker represent? Well, now, I mean, after 80 years of history, mental illness are the two, things that people associate with Joker. So, yes, there's a lot of progress to be made, but I try to stay positive, and I think that there is a lot of folks that are doing really, really hard work to make sure that mental health issues are better represented in media in general, entertainment media, and especially comics. I was on a panel the other day with a creator who said that he was trying to be very mindful about how these issues are portrayed, and that he didn't want to do any harm, which I thought was a really admirable thing for a creator to say, and to to want to make sure that they're not putting something out there in the public that could potentially be harmful or problematic in some ways. So.
The arc of this conversation got me thinking about a challenge that I'm seeing emerging, and it is this. On the one hand, you have a movie, say Joker or anything, not just Joker, but any movie where they're represented, there's a reputation of mental health as sort of contributing to violence in some way, and a lot of those movies and comics make a lot of money. But often when you have somebody trying to deal with it in a more sort of representational way, sort of like a 13 Reasons Why, or the Jessica Jones stands apart in a way. There's something really special about that show. That I've worked a lot with people in sexual harassment, and that show was a gem. I don't know how it got to where it got to, but it did something really special. But for 13 Reasons Why, it got a lot of, there's been a cancel culture thing surrounding 13 Reasons Why. And when Tom King tried to do Heroes in Crisis and be representational and metaphorical about it, he got a lot of blowback. So how do you deal with, say, somebody at a publisher or at an entertainment a company that says, if I say somebody's nuts and kills people, I make $1 million, I make billions of dollars, but if I try to be representational, I'm going to get canceled. How do you talk to those people? How do you persuade them that it's worth continuing doing? And how would you advise creators to do things so that they don't fall into the same traps that some of these more controversial representational shows have fallen into?
I mean, being blunt.
I encourage that. That'd be great.
I love it.
Crazy.
No, I think, sometimes at the end of the day, businesses, publishers, whatever,
Right.
they have people they got to answer to, they got money they got to make, right? So at the end of the day, that's my job, is making sure that happens. Of course, I also think it's very important to have proper representation, inclusivity, while maintaining the best stories possible. That is my goal. And so I think, as an editor, my goal is to either figure out a way to communicate to my bosses and get them to see what I see in the project, or communicate the project in a way that gets my bosses to see dollar signs. Really, that's at the end of the day, that's what it is. So if they're looking for a big, giant superhero story, I have to show my bosses how this story of representation is a big, giant superhero story. And I have to sell them that first. Whereas, to the 16-year-old girl who's struggling with anxiety and depression, that's the story that I'm selling her, and I'm selling her representation. So it's, you look at films these days, they have 3 different cuts of a trailer. They'll have a cut of a trailer that's going to be more horror inclined because they want to get the horror audience. They have the one that's more action movie because they want to get the action audience, and the one that's more comedy, that's how you do that. Honestly, as an editor, that's how I get the people above, is I have to sell them how representation gets them dollar signs, which is very frustrating, because it shouldn't be that way, but that's the struggle that I face personally, and I don't have the answer.
No.
I wish I did.
No, but you've managed to do it in the past.
I have managed to do it,
which
yeah.
is rare. So.
Yeah, which, working with properties that sell just based on their names helps, right? You put Deadpool on anything, you're pretty much guaranteed you're going to get a certain amount of money. But Deadpool's another good example of a character that mental illness and violence is associated with. But there's something that the writers have been able to capture that has still humanized the characters, or the character, in a very, it hasn't always been positive, but I think it's definitely over the past several years been pushing more into it, the healthier representation. So that helps having a name brand character.
No, but
yeah, I think if you as a creator have chosen to introduce these elements into your story, you need to approach them honestly and truthfully. And that goes with whether you're writing a major IP, Batman, Superman, Archie, whatever, or your own stuff. And my detective series talks about this guy who's struggling with alcoholism and his recovery. And 4 out of the 5 books, he's in recovery. And I've had people say, I really wish you'd kept him drunk longer. And that's not his story. And I think if I wasn't approaching it honestly, and if I was approaching it more from what's the story that's going to be more compelling or get more people to buy it or kind of fit into the genre better, then I probably would have done that. But I think as creators or as editors curating and managing IP that people recognize, if you have these characters overlap with things that we are dealing with every day that should be spoken about in casual conversation, and the fact that we have to have this concentrated moment to discuss it is great, but we should get to the point where this is just something you talk about over coffee without any kind of filter. When you have characters that are recognizable when they interact with these things, you have to do it in an honest way. Otherwise, and I think that's why Jessica Jones resonates so well, because it's a superhero story, but it's honestly dealing with PTSD, it's dealing with alcoholism, it's dealing with a lot of weighty stuff, but it's done in such a meaningful way, and it's just treated like it's happening. It's not done, there isn't a big reveal where she's cured at the end, where it's like you were just under this spell. It's like she's dealing with the stuff because she's gone through a lot of stuff. So I think when you do that, you need to do it in an honest way, and that's the best way to get meaningful content. That's it.
I think I'm kind of spinning off of what you're saying. My thought about this is that the best way to get these issues looked at is to get people who are good writers. That one of the hallmarks of any good writer is that they understand subtlety. They don't think in black and white. They don't create characters who are one-dimensional. They create characters who are multi-dimensional, we can sympathize with this part of them and not with that part of them. We can say, they did a bad thing, but I don't think they're a bad person. I think they're a flawed person. So Jessica Jones is a really good example of the fact that that's a good representation because it's well written. I remember, this is more about representation than mental health, but I remember reading The Invisibles and seeing Fanny. And Fanny is a trans woman. And Fanny is absolutely a fascinating, wonderfully written, complex character. And I, just was, every scene with Fanny, I was like, oh, I gotta find out what's going on with Fanny. And as, someone who's a straight white guy, like that opened my eyes to some things. But Grant Morrison is a really good writer. And so you've gotta, so basically, I guess we gotta keep the hacks away from our subject, folks.
You've got a bright future.
Can I jump in? So I want this authenticity and the ability to imbue these genre characters, something authentic and compelling, has got me thinking. I guess we're moving so quickly. I'm wondering how this is all connecting with you all out there, and if anybody has anything that they want to have any questions that you want to ask of our panel, or sort of join the sort of take this discussion in some other directions.
All right, I've heard with Shia
Stand up.
Yeah, please do.
The main, say, looked at person for Moon Knight. I'm kind of worried that with his DID, dissociative identity disorder, that it will be misrepresented, and it's going to take away from the character rather than be portrayed in a way that it's just a natural thing for people with that. It happens constantly. You can't control it. So I'm just kind of worried that do you guys have any worry about Moon Knight and the representation of that? that's gonna carry?
It's so weird. I was
Yeah.
just thinking about Moon Knight 2 seconds before your question. I'm not BSing you. Like I really was. I was like, this is a character that's clearly suffering something that may be a little common, but is also can be misconstrued for impact. You know, just to have a cool story, like he can have this episode and it'll lead into a battle with Bushwhacker or whatever villain he's dealing with in the moment. So all I can do is hope that they handle it with care and thoughtfulness, and you know, are good writers that can do that with subtlety and nuance and still get that great narrative impact. So fingers crossed with you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, you know, the one thing that I do give props to the Marvel Netflix series is they've handled representation with mental health, you know, as you've seen with Jessica Jones very, very well, even Punisher, you know, representation of that, of veteran PTSD very, very well.
Yep.
And honestly, and very, very transparent, of the ramifications for better or worse. And so if it's being handled by the same minds, I'm very hopeful, you know, I'm very, very hopeful.
I'm also hopeful, and just to add on to, since everyone mentioned Jessica Jones, I've been on a couple of panels with to a class in Los Angeles area with some of the writers. So part of the issue with that was they had great writers, but both the producer and several of the writers had these concepts in their head. You know, and by the way, some of the writers, actually parents and other people, partners, were mental health professionals, psychiatrists or psychologists. So they had like ready access to consultants or unofficial consultants. And so I think that's when when Bill and I've worked with folks, I think the hardest thing is trying to translate what we think about as clinicians to their language. What matters to us, why should it matter to them? And most of the time, if we can translate it to dollars, that's the strongest.
It's the hardest conversation.
And I was going to add on to what Heather originally said about, in order to sell great things, sometimes you have to just put everything in dollar signs. And that's exactly what marketing has to do, is to show people why you should carry this book, why you should, you know, give this book attention and things like that. And with publishers, a lot of it really is dollars. And it's a shame, but if I can translate things into dollars and make a difference, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna sell the heck out of it, so.
And kind of to go off what you were saying about having someone to consult, I think that's really important to any writer or creator. Vasilis and I are actually friends. We met in Scott Snyder's writing class, and you know, we've been friends ever since. And so he's somebody that I tap all the time if I'm writing something about this. There was a Vertigo story that I did, I don't know, a few years ago, and dealt with suicide, and I didn't want to do something that would hurt somebody. And so I workshopped it with him extensively before I ever even turned in the script, because I didn't want it to, you know, trigger somebody. I wanted it to be dealt with respectfully, and I think that's important, to have somebody that you can tap for that kind of thing.
What was I going to say?
Just karaoke.
Yeah.
Well,
No.
are there any,
Yeah.
you have a
Go ahead.
question here? Okay.
I have
Here and then back in the back,
question.
okay.
Sorry. I have two questions, but I like one better than the other.
We'll go with the one you like better, since I know this.
Yeah, do you think there is a comedical way to represent mental health in media?
Do you think, so the question is, do you think there's a comedic way to represent mental health in media?
Because
And-
it's all drama,
Mhm.
and everything I've watched is always drama, and I think people are constantly using comedy when you have a mental illness to always like make a joke about it or like kind of relax at that point.
I see Heather's about to pull something up.
I'm trying to figure out the name of the show, and I can't remember what it's
Well, I'll
called.
say, one of the things about being in LA
Crazy.
is that the stand-up comedy world is really, really entrenched there. And I actually used to teach in classes in a comic store that had one of the biggest stand-up stages in the city, one of the best. And so I've seen a lot of stand-ups, and the stand-up comedy community has dealt with, there's a few people out there with mental illnesses themselves that are dealing with it, and I think it's been great. And when you hear them, they are using humor very specifically. You're right that I feel like when if we turn on anything that's just like fiction, like a TV show or a movie, that we don't see it handled with humor very often. And in the past, it was handled with humor really badly, usually. You know, it was like kind of every stereotype in the world would get trotted out, and all the, stupid misperceptions. So, but maybe they need to just get more stand-ups to write more good shows.
I was going to, if you haven't seen, it's another Netflix show. I guess, are we sponsored by Netflix?
No, we should buy.
I know, we're about to be next year. No, there's this great new show on Netflix that just came out this summer called Dead to Me. With Christina Applegate.
It's so good.
It's so good. And it's so
Everybody
funny
binge
and
watch.
I watched the entire season in one night.
No judgment.
It's great. I would do it again. It's so good. But it's such a great. It's again very honest, and that's I think the key with all of this is honesty. And there's in the best stand-up comics, they're speaking from truth, and they're being very transparent with that. And the show Dead to Me. It's without giving too much away. It's about a woman who's grieving the sudden loss of her husband. And going through the stages of grief and all the twists and turns that come along the way. But it's honest in the depression and the anger and the grief and the anxiety and the trauma and everything with it. And I think it's hard, but anything worth it is, and it can very well be done.
And I will add, just to build on something, because you may not want to just talk about your own stuff, but you were the one who got me to see that Deadpool, in many ways, the comedic aspect of Deadpool, part of what makes the character so compelling is not the type of, just make a funny superhero and other people get into it, but it doesn't work that way. Part of what made the character so compelling was the pain. Mm-hmm. And that you're talking about that a while back, got me to see the character in an entirely different way.
Thank you.
So.
Pain is humor.
Yeah.
It's not good though.
Can I say something on that? So I think, yes, you can have comedy, and think about any other issue. Could you have comedy about gender? Could you have comedy about ethnicity? Could you have comedy about other issues? Yeah, you could. It's just how you do it. Mm-hmm. And I think what I said earlier about the quantity and the quality increase, if we get that up, then actually I think creators are much more free to do all kinds of different things related to mental health. The problem is when you get bombarded solely with or primarily with equals violence equals this and all these stereotypes, that's when it's the problem. Right? And so when we can get past that, I think then we have a lot more freedom to use this like any other issue that's out there.
I think I was on a panel yesterday with Vita Ayala, who is a very, very talented writer, and it was a panel on representation and diversity in our media, and they said a thing that was very very succinct, I think, and it's about writing. There's a difference between writing from and writing about, and I think when it comes especially to things like mental health awareness, no matter the genre, be it comedy, be it horror, be it superhero action, whatever, there's a difference if you're writing from and writing about, and it makes a huge difference.
It does, but I do think there is a lot to be said for when you're writing about doing your homework and making sure that what you're trying to tell, you've talked to people who've experienced it, you've done your research, because it's so easy to veer into just, like we were talking about, glorification because of entertainment. You're doing it just to get that response. But yeah, I mean, there's a way to make writing about closer to writing from if you do the work.
There was a question in the back. Yes, there.
So I think it's so important to represent the pain of mental illness, and I'm interested in how people respond to that pain, sometimes in very maladaptive ways, and the fact that viewers sometimes get ideas from the characters, but the in relationships. We see this with all kinds of things, that people think what they see on the screen is what real life is going to look like. And I'm thinking about myself when I've been in that depressive hole, and what has come to mind has been like a type of self-harm I've seen a character engage in. And so I think it's so important to represent, but there's also, I'm curious what you think what guidelines you think can be followed in writing those stories so that they don't seem attractive to viewers to recreate in their own lives.
I really feel that we have to be careful when we start saying that the media causes people to do X. And partly it's because we see and experience things, we wake up and we have an entire day full of seeing things in real life, talking to people in real life, seeing the cover of a magazine, anything that's not necessarily, that's media, but all these things that are not media. And you can't protect, if you start thinking I have to, cover up certain things because it may cause problems, I think you run into problems. On the other hand, I think the idea that people are putting warnings on, media content and saying there's going to be this NPR, I'm an NPR listener, so NPR will always say, there's going to be content of this kind and it may be triggering for people. And I think that's a good idea. So there's got to be some middle ground, because you don't ever want to, glorify, this is what we're talking about, you guys were talking about, glorifying versus showing. But there's kind of no getting around, I think, at least some media, right? Not every example, but, some media showing, the dark sides of the mental illness.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll have some different opinions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a really controversial topic, obviously, and I'm glad that you asked the question. And Jim, I'm glad that you have your perspective, and I do think that there's a middle ground. And I think we also have to realize that two things can be true at the same time, right? I mean, obviously, we have freedom of speech, and we need and should cherish creative freedom. And at the same time, I think it's true that 13 Reasons Why is one of the most recent examples, but imitative behavior from media representations that are potentially problematic is a real thing. I mean, there is pretty compelling evidence, scientific evidence, that has demonstrated a correlation between season 1 of 13 Reasons Why and self-injury.
Is there, I guess my thought is how much? How much is it? And you would know more than me, so you guys listening have more than me.
Yeah, and then anecdotally, I mean, my wife is a psychiatry resident.
Talk about the ER admissions from just.
Oh yeah, my wife is a psych resident. She's in her 2nd year, and she's currently on psych ER night shift for the month. So it's a very stressful shift for both of us. But she just told me the other day that somebody came in who had watched, is it called Unbelieved? I think.
Unbelievable?
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And that had triggered them to self-injure. So, I mean, it's a real phenomenon.
It happens, but that's an anecdote. So
that is an anecdote.
We were talking beforehand, and Bill was trotting out statistics because he knows all this stuff, and so does Praveen.
Well, I'll let Praveen speak to it.
Yeah.
So I think when you say media affects behavior, causes behavior broadly, is a broad statement. What I can say is that for self-violence, definitely we've got pretty compelling evidence. So suicide, self-harm, there are guidelines out there. By the way, journalists have adopted them.
And fictional
guidelines as well. We have been involved on consultation on those things. So there's actually certain factors that will reduce the chance of that happening. So you can still tell the story, you just have to use some of these other factors to kind of mitigate the harm, right? And so that's where consultation comes in. people wouldn't know that, unless we just educate the public and whatnot. I mean, we're very specialized in this area. Whether that's true for other things that we don't know yet, or we haven't studied, like more subtle behaviors, who knows? I mean, I think it's not that hard to buy that media influences our behavior. I think that's different than saying X causes Y, right?
It's interesting though that your point that you're making is very much the point that you are making.
Yes.
Like it's very specific to that point. So yeah, and again, these guys are experts, and I read a lot, but.
But I think there's a way to do all of those things that when we start seeing them as harm, there's ways to depict that and look at how to mitigate that, right? And so if you think about it from, like, let's say a public health perspective, we can't predict that, okay, this one X is going to cause Y here, but just like with a heart attack, we don't know, is it the cigarettes, the cheeseburger, the whatever, but hey, if you kind of do these things to mitigate your risk, it's less of a chance of it happening. We can do the same with media.
Wow, so many questions. Over here in the left, the red jacket top thing.
Do you think that I always hear a lot of talk about mental health representation in media and how people want that, but I want to know, do you think that there's a way to also represent like mental disorders or quote-unquote learning disorders such as autism or ADHD, and how that's not often grouped in the same class as mental health, since mental health is often thought of as anxiety and depression, whereas another thing is something that you're more often thought of that you're born with rather than you develop? Like, do you think that they're kind of just the same method to go about to get representation of them, or is there different methods for each one?
So the question the question concerns, are there different ways that one should go about trying to represent different types of mental health? Because there's one set of perspective, one set of influences goes into autism, and there's another that goes into other types of. I'm interested in hearing the responses here. I see, Lisa, you have the mic.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it goes back to a lot of what's been said already. It's about creators being open-minded and doing their due diligence when it comes to representing, whatever topic is at hand that they may not have personal experience with. It's, tapping into folks that have lived through those experiences and making sure that they're being incorporated in what's being created. And it's also, I think, broadening the pool of people who are doing the creating too, right? You want to have people with varied experiences creating art, and then it's also trying to sell the corporations who own, all of the IP and the create the abilities for folks to make art, to recognize that it's something worthwhile doing. So, while individual issues require, some specific attention, I think at the end of the day, the overall strategy is applicable broadly.
I agree.
I know it's not fiction, but I actually really enjoy a lot of Netflix again, biographies and things like that. There was a great one on Teddy Roosevelt where they actually said that this guy was just really, really, really driven, and to the point that a lot of people feel like he would probably be, if he went through our school system today, like they might have addressed things like his hyperactivity and things like that, because he did everything, and he was kind of all over the place, and it was just a different time. And to have like nonfiction, people who are heroes who have made a difference, in history, to hear about those particular people and how they have things like dyslexia, like Pac-Man dyslexia, I think, right? And some other American figures had that and struggled through it in real life. I think it's very significant too, and inspiring that even though they dealt with this, and at that time they probably didn't know what it was, and was able to kind of overcome that and deal with it, I think it's pretty empowering to hear. So it'll be nice to have some of those biographies done in, comics, or on a TV show or something like that.
And I know I was just part of a panel yesterday that talked about how in the marketplace, those biographical books of people dealing with mental health issues generally, they're being recognized as a growing market segment. So there is definitely something to that in our particular space.
I just want to give a quick shout out to the advocacy community for autism, because I feel like they have really been really good at waking people up. I wish they would still talk to all the people I know who are diagnosing their friends with Asperger's and their partners. But still, it's been really good, and I think that's, a panel like this is advocating for these issues, and I think they've been doing a really good job. There's a ways to go.
I know we've hit 10 o'clock, and I know that some of you will be here anyway afterwards to continue the conversation. I know others have places to go. But I'm wondering, before we go, if you could just give the last word, any last thoughts, if you'd like to say to our audience, anything connected to this topic.
I think one of the most, and it's, as mental health awareness is still being destigmatized, it's still a bit of a stigma to say I have depression or I suffer from PTSD because of everything that we've discussed tonight. I think it's so important to open up with your inner circles and just talk about it, and it's a thing. I think, in my personal family, it's stigmatized, depression and PTSD, and you don't talk about it. It's the thing that you don't talk about. It's shamed. You don't need, we're gonna pretend it doesn't exist, which is very unhealthy. And so the more strength that you have to talk about it in your inner circles, the more normal it becomes for everyone else, because they see you and they love you and they like you, and this is just a normal thing about you, and if they can accept that with someone in their inner circle, then it makes it easier for them to accept it from someone else.
Totally. This is great. It's always an honor to be on this panel. I think as creators, the onus is really on us to tell these stories as honestly as possible and to be representative and make not just normalize, but have these conversations in our art, but also in our day-to-day. We live in this 24-hour news cycle where we're on, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. It's like this barrage of information, and I think we need to just take a step back and not only talk about what we're going through, but also listen to what other people are going through and be available to listen. I can't tell you how many times someone will just say thank you for reaching out. Thank you for asking me how I'm doing, or listening, or providing an ear and being open to that. So I think we just need to step back sometimes as a society and be mindful of what might be going on. We don't know. I never know what, it's so easy to gripe at your barista or honk at the person that cut you off in the car, and we have no idea what anyone is dealing with because we haven't asked. So this is a step in that direction, having that conversation. So.
Yeah, similarly, the thought that I had, if you want to walk away with a word from this, there's many, but empathy, then, we want people to have empathy for these issues and for people like us. And we're sorely lacking empathy in America right now. And that's on, yes, talking about politically too, but it's like both sides. Everybody's forgetting. And the other thing is, there's a sort of, let's do the right thing, right? It is not wrong to say there's a moral imperative to be fair to people who have mental illnesses. It's the right thing to do. And that's been forgotten. We have a lot of you can't tell me what to do culture. It's like, I'm not telling you what to do, but this is kind of the right thing to do.
I know from personal experience, when you're in a career where you have to be happy and excited all the time, and you run social media and things like that, there's a certain image that you have to project, and sometimes it's very hard to actually be vulnerable with somebody, even people that's in your lives. And even if you have a hard time doing that with people that you are close to, sometimes it's actually kind of nice to open up to a stranger. So I personally, right now, I go to a counselor every Tuesday at 9 a.m. to just talk about things and be able to kind of talk to somebody without fear of judgment and things like that. Or a lot of times people close to you they're so, they want the best things for you, and they'll tell you their opinions and try to problem solve. But sometimes that's not what you need from your close friends. Sometimes you just want them to be able to just hug you. But it's okay to talk to somebody. Like, I know when I went through a few things in the past, I didn't seek counseling. What's funny is I reached out to people that I did not know from other states and started talking to them and ended up making really great friends. But sometimes it's nice to have somebody that you regularly go to and, have an objective look at everything. They don't know what you've been putting up on Facebook or social media, which is usually just the best part of your lives. And like they said, like sometimes you might see their lives as this wonderful, shiny, post with lots of likes, and they could be going through a lot of different things. So I know my personal social media is always just happy, and because I have a lot of people in business there. But there's people that I'm able to open up with my personal lives, and sometimes they're in a different state because it's okay to open up to strangers or open up to people that aren't in your daily lives. So, yeah, seek objective help whenever you can.
All right, so I know everyone's waiting, or waiting to go, so I'll make it quick. I think what Heather said, I really appreciate what you said. So I think that you guys have all the power, right? So money is what talks, right? You're the consumer. You can choose what content you consume, right? But the other part is that I think the thing that changes stigma and mental health related stigma and discrimination are a couple of things. One is like cultural change, but another is contact. So Heather was talking about contact. So if you know someone, you're talking about it, then all these different stereotypes get broken in your head, right? And that contact could be in person, but that also could be through art. People see art and that shapes them, even if it's a fictional character, it shapes them in culture. And so I just want to leave you with that we actually, as audience members and as just people in society connected to other people, we actually have a lot of the power. And I think if you believe in this issue, as I do, and I know the panelists do, you can really make a change for society for the better.
Well, all I'm going to say is thank you, everybody on the panel. It's been a pleasure, as always. I really appreciate everybody's participation and what your experiences are with this and how you feel about it. And I want to thank the audience, who, it's past 10 o'clock now, and it just speaks to the fact that this is a real issue that people care about, and the conversation is growing, and I'm happy to be a part of it. So give yourselves a round of applause.
Thank you all for coming. It's funny, we're in this space where people fly and they run really fast, and there's tragedy and comedy and all these sort of things, but it comes down to there's this authenticity and this honesty, because in the end, all of these stories are all about ourselves. And so thank you all so much for sharing, and thank you again to our panelists.